Hello, this is Elizabeth.
There she is. Hello, Elizabeth.
So who's that?
That's Rick.
Oh, hi, Rick. So where are you?
I'm at home, like most people.
Is everyone else on?
Yes, everybody's on, and it is 4 o'clock, so we can start. Anthony, would you please do the roll call?
I can. So can you guys hear me okay?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay. Let's get started. Councilmember Widmer,
Here.
Weist,
He was on.
okay. Councilmember Lempress,
I'm here.
Vice Mayor Lewis,
Here.
and Mayor DeGolia.
Yep.
Hi, if you said anything, I'm at the end of a hub and you guys can just guess my computer difficulties.
There's his big face.
At least you can see me now.
Okay, so we have no presentations. This is a point where anybody can provide, any of the public can provide public comment, or we'll also enable public comment in the discussion during the meeting. Anthony, do you have anyone that has indicated to you that they'd like to provide public comment?
None.
Okay, is there anybody on the line that wishes to make public comment on the fly? Okay, hearing none, why don't we go to the city manager's report?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, members of the council. This meeting is purely to do a couple of things. One is to review and discuss the staff report, which you all have, certify the continuing emergency, and ratify those rules and regulations that were enacted by myself as the Director of Emergency Services in response to COVID-19. As you know, early into the pandemic in February, the county began taking their proactive actions. And on March 3rd, the county declared a state of emergency. The governor followed with a similar state of emergency on March 4th. On March 13th, we issued a proclamation of local emergency, which was subsequently ratified by the City Council on March 18th. On March 16th, the county's health order initiated a shelter-in-place order across a broad spectrum of activities that continues until April 7th. The governor did the same thing, although his shelter-in-place order does not have a termination date. So pursuant to, on March 18th, when the City Council reviewed and approved the declaration of emergency, the council also provided me with some specific direction regarding construction activity in town. Pursuant to council direction, as the Director of Emergency Services, I ordered that all construction activity in the town be suspended for the duration of the shelter-in-place order. Presently, that's April 7th. That included the town center project. Construction sites were provided the opportunity to finalize their ongoing construction work and seal up their sites and weatherproof them. The activity was allowed to continue through Saturday, March 21st, and sites that needed additional time to comply were provided with that time on a case-by-case basis with consultation with the building official and myself. On March 19th, the governor enacted their shelter-in-place order, ordering all individuals in the state to stay at home or at their place of residence, except as needed to maintain a continuity of operations of specific identified federal critical infrastructure sectors. The governor's order also empowered local agencies to take such actions deemed necessary to preserve and protect the health and safety of their communities in light of their specific circumstances. The governor's order, as I mentioned, does not have an end date. As the Director of Emergency Services, I took specific actions. Those are listed in the staff report. There's about 15 of them, and there are other minor things that we did as well. The City Council will have these regular meetings weekly to certify the continuing emergency and ratify any rules and regulations enacted by the Director of Emergency Services in response to COVID-19. With respect to specific residential construction activity, at this time, construction is either under review or prohibited in a number of communities. Menlo Park, as you know, just recently enacted their ban on all construction. Woodside did the same last night. Portola Valley was one of the first communities to do so, and other communities are evaluating the situation as they move forward, mostly in response to a continuing health concern in the broader community, as well as the ability of their agencies to respond. The town has issued or initiated, sorry, a Builders Roundtable subcommittee to assist us in identifying ways that if and when the council decides to relax the order on local construction, ways that we could do that. That committee did meet yesterday, and we worked through a number of issues. I'll be summarizing that report and putting it back out to the subcommittee so that they can provide some additional feedback on it before it's presented to the council again, probably at your April 1st meeting at 4 p.m. As the Director of Emergency Services, I'll be regularly reviewing those specific actions that are listed in the shelter-in-place order and the town's declaration of local emergency. That review will be conducted with the City Council weekly as long as the emergency persists. Modifications can be made based on local circumstances or applicable law as those changes occur. In addition, as the Director of Emergency Services, limited exceptions may be granted to any of the listed specific actions to protect life, health, or safety, provided that they are done in a manner that's consistent with all applicable local, county, state, and federal orders. That concludes the staff report. Welcome and open discussion. It's recommended that at the conclusion that the council review and discuss this, certify the continuing emergency, and ratify the rules that have been enacted thus far. That concludes the staff report.
Are there any questions regarding the staff report?
I have none.
No.
Okay.
I did have a question. I'm sorry, Elizabeth, do you want to go? Go ahead.
No, go ahead, Mike.
I just, what exactly did Woodside do last night? You mentioned that kind of quickly. What did they do?
They also, initially they had, taken the action to ban all construction, but that was done by Kevin, the town manager there. So the council last night certified that and banned all local construction projects.
So could you just summarize for me your understanding of where sort of construction bans stand with regard to the county, Portola Valley, Woodside, Menlo Park, and us?
Sure. So Menlo Park, Portola Valley, and Woodside, they are all just like Atherton. They've banned all construction activity in the communities. And they, of course, allow emergency permits, just like we do. The county, however, does allow construction activity on housing projects, does not allow it on commercial projects unless they're considered essential facilities. But for residential construction, it is allowed, whether it's market rate, affordable, or otherwise.
Thank you.
My discussion with
Okay.
Mr.
So
Kelly.
I have a question.
Okay.
I have a question.
Go ahead. Go ahead, Elizabeth.
So, George, where are we with the town center project? I know that we included that in the ban to be consistent with what we're requiring our residential community to stop construction. But there was some issues with the contract, and there was not a clause in the contract that dealt with suspension of activities.
There are some contract issues that our legal counsel is probably going to be dealing with over the next week or more. The concern is if the project does not continue or is not allowed to continue after a 30-day period, there are options that the contractor has under the contract. But at present, all work is stopped on the town center project. They are, of course, allowed to access the site for non-construction activities. But it is something that the council may wish to consider moving forward. That is the one and only construction site in town that the town can control and monitor closely with respect to its social distancing implementation.
So even though the residents came out in full force to object to it continuing, if we just keep it closed until the current projected shutdown end date of April 7th, even if the county extends that date, and my other question is, do we think that the county may extend that date? But would we consider reopening it so we don't come close to that 30-day time period of having it shut down to jeopardize our contract?
That is certainly something the council could consider. I would suggest that, well, let me back up a second. Amoroso was on the Builders Roundtable phone call yesterday, so they did participate in some of that discussion. And in fact, they provided a lot of information with respect to what they're doing on a lot of their state and federal projects that they are currently in the middle of construction with. So they have been implementing social distancing. They said they're well aware of how to do that on some of those larger projects. And the town center project is indeed a larger project than many of our residential projects. So there is a lot
Sure.
more space. But like I said, it still needs to be monitored, and there are still some things and standards that need to be implemented that when the shelter in place order was originally implemented, they were not doing. So it may take them a little bit to catch up with some of those.
So I hope that we can have a little discussion with the other council members as to what their opinions are on this before we end the meeting.
Well, certainly it's an appropriate thing to discuss under the general discussion. Is there any other questions regarding the city manager's report? Okay. I think we can then move into the general discussion. George, do you want to frame that?
Well, all that this meeting is in particular is to look at those 15 items that we've done so far, that we've enacted as measures under the declaration of emergency. You'll be certifying those. The only one that has really been, actually there's been two that have been had some significant conversation, has been the residential and construction of the town center, as well as the issue with respect to gardeners and landscapers. That's been another conversation that's going on in the community at large. Our response to the gardener and landscaper question is that is specifically called out within the county's shelter in place order as a non-essential service. So it's not the town that would need to authorize gardening and landscaping activity to continue. It's the county that would need to do that because that's under their shelter in place order. We do allow for wildfire urban interface cleaning, tree trimming that is is connected to a fire hazard or some sort of safety concern on the property. Those sorts of activity are allowed to continue. But if it is designed for just beautification of the property or general maintenance, it's not allowed under the county shelter in place order. Those are the two I think the council should have some general conversation around. As long as the other 15 items, I would certainly understand the council supports at this point.
Well, I agree that we should not be bringing our landscapers into the town at this time, not only for our safety, but for their safety also, because, and I believe that most of our residents will continue to pay them for their services, at least throughout the county shutdown deadline. I know that I am because, you know, they've been with me for, you know, a long time. And, but that's an individual call. And I think a 3-week hiatus from having your mow, blow, and go is probably the best thing for not having all that stirred up and dust and debris and other pollutants that happen when they're blowing their and cleaning on the street, on the right-of-ways. A lot more people seem to be out walking their dogs or walking, you know, around in the neighborhood, social distancing, but getting some fresh air. And I just think that not having the gardeners out there blowing is a good thing during this time.
Any other comment on this?
Well,
Go
go ahead,
Mike.
Kara.
Mike first.
I was just going to say, I'm not sure we can do anything about the gardeners. I mean, we couldn't create an exemption to the county rule anyway, could we?
That's
No.
correct.
Yeah, okay. I will say, for what it's worth, that I'm one of those people, Elizabeth said, is doing a lot of walking, and there are an awful lot of gardeners who are simply driving their trucks behind these gates and closing the gates and going ahead and doing their job. You can see it as you walk around. Yeah.
Oh, wow.
And I would agree with everybody here that I do think for the most part, our residents are very generous and still taking care of their gardeners. And I see no reason to ignore the county's direction on this particular topic.
Well, as Mike said, I'm not sure that we can. I believe we can make things more restrictive than the state and the county, but I don't think we can make it less restrictive.
I think that's right. And I'll just say, I had questioned the idea of, well, is it really a problem if a gardener works alone or works with a family member who he or she is with anyway? And in fact, the gardeners are going from property to property, so they present a risk to themselves and others that's different because of the multiple properties that they go to. And I think that's a good perspective that we should think about. I'm sure that you all have gotten some emails on the subject. I've gotten probably a half a dozen emails on the subject. And people understand it when it's explained to them. And as George said, if the gardener is doing something for health or safety, then that is acceptable under the emergency services. But most of the work isn't. I had one situation with a woman up on Reservoir Road who needed brush cleared to prevent a fire hazard, and her gardener was going to do it. And I told her that that is, acceptable. And that was specifically discussed today on the county call. But in general, I don't think there's anything we can do about it.
There's another issue that's come up recently, a request from a resident for clarification on pool service cleaning. It's not specifically addressed in the health order, but the resident's concern was more driven by a concern that if they don't clean the pool on a regular basis, that it could become a sanitary issue. I kind of agree with that, but it's not listed specifically in the shelter in place order as an essential service, and it's not called out as a non-essential service. So I think there's some leeway with respect to what the town can interpret for that particular one. Does the council have any feedback on that?
Yeah, I think I agree with your assessment, George. Pools that aren't clean get algae in there. You have the chlorine put in regularly. They have to be monitored. So I think that's a health and safety issue.
So I would ask, how long, usually pool services come every week on a weekly basis. Can a pool not be cleaned or serviced for 2 weeks or 3 weeks? I'm sure if it wasn't serviced for 2 months or 3 months, then, you'd have some bad things. I don't know.
I will say that in the winter months, it is typically every other week. And then in summer months, as it starts to heat up, it's every week.
Right, I agree.
I would agree with the health and safety concern.
Mm-hmm.
I think
Okay.
a lot of it also depends on frequency of use, and with folks at home more, as well as their kids, as it warms up, they may get more use.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, certainly it can be done less than every week. I don't have my pool done every week because it doesn't get that much use. I think that people can manage it, but it's probably a worthwhile thing to ask on the county call to see what the interpretation there is. I would defer to that it's a sanitary issue and it should be acceptable. But I'll take the lead to ask on the county call on that.
Thanks, Rick.
I think on the issue that you raised, Elizabeth, about the town center, we should have an opportunity to talk with the city attorney about the legal issue. I definitely do not want to risk putting ourselves in a position where the contractor could terminate the contract. It took us, as everyone knows, a long time to get a contractor on this job. And we got a contractor and they're about a third of the way done. And I don't think we want to lose them and face the penalties that would incur.
I will interject as
Agree.
well. I agree with Rick on that. And we are dealing with a 4-acre parcel. And I will also say that they've been, along with the other contractors in the community, very informative on steps and things and procedures that are changing and evolving. So a lot of good stuff is coming out of the roundtable component Rick and myself have been attending.
Yeah, just
I'd love to hear more about, I'm sorry, I'd love to hear more about the roundtable stuff. I find that's important to me, just to learn more about how people are approaching that and what kinds of things we're working through. Could either of you kind of give us a sense of what those discussions have been covered?
Do you want to do that, Carrie, or?
Well, I can start to touch. I think that Rick and myself have taken an approach from a resident perspective that surrounds a construction site, as well as concerns from the construction industry. And I think that Rick and I would both agree, I think everybody in the meeting, it's paramount concern of public safety. There's not one contractor that's here saying, hey, this is about a money related issue, other than trying to make sure some of these employees that really don't make any money at work, to some degree, but still trying to keep this component safe. So I think that, Mike, we've started conversations related to how do we deal with the public right of way, and keeping people, contractors, the food truck component, addressing some of the concerns that neighbors have mentioned about keeping that area clear, and including the component of deliveries, and trying to make everything, if it's a direction that we would be going in, to make it isolated to the site area, and then addressing, as the contractors entering, the subcontractor contractors entering the site, basically, if there's a protocol to come into play to make sure we monitor how many people, if there's an agreement on a number of people that are going to be on each site. We haven't determined, I would say, yet, or a breakdown on how we determine how many people on a site. Is it just a flat number, period? But also taking into consideration there are some smaller lots, and how do we, do that? The contractors are very much aware of trying to get the message to all their employees related to social distancing and a lot of other factors, keeping things clean, and they're very willing to work with the town in whatever direction, if the town comes up with opening this up, to keep things clean, because we did hear from some residents related to porta potties. Even in our meeting last week, there were several of us that made comments about people sitting together, exchanging phones, and so on and so forth, to which obviously is not acceptable during this period of time. So, I would have to say that this is kind of an evolving process, and a lot of good information is coming to the table, and just trying to figure out how we can, if this is a direction we're going, even with the Amoroso project, with our contractors project, because there's some deep concerns on our contractors project, worried about supplies coming in, and some of these projects may be put off for a very long period of time, if the supply chain to their construction site gets cut off from, in essence, the outside world. Rick, if you'd like to add more.
I have a question. Go ahead, Rick.
Well, let me just add to the summary, and then we'll take questions.
Okay.
So yesterday at 4, we had a call. There were about, 15, maybe a little more people on the call. That included Carrie, myself, George, members of the building department, a couple other staff members, and a number of builders who have been participants in the Builders Roundtable. We had a very good discussion, which George led, based on a agenda that had been sent out that basically listed some suggested ideas for guidelines. They weren't developed, but they were general areas for ideas for guidelines that were along the lines of exactly what Carrie just defined. Numbers of people that might be limited at a site, numbers of people limited to a room, how to enforce social distancing, what kind of cleaning to do in terms of both what specific things should be regularly cleaned and how often. The idea of getting a list of everyone that would enter the site and have the project manager strictly responsible for monitoring people coming in through a gate. So it wouldn't just be a wide open site. There'd have to be essentially a gate, which I think there is on almost every site. And there were ideas that were put out about, you know, both being able to get people to sign a statement that they weren't sick or hadn't incurred certain, you know, cough, fever, cold-like symptoms, or that they didn't know that they'd been around someone that had had that. So there were a whole lot of ideas that were thrown out that I think the intent of it is to establish some guidelines. And it was expressed by a couple of the people on the phone that their greatest concern wasn't for their projects in and of themselves, but it was for the employees who were very hand to mouth and paycheck to paycheck. And to cut these people off, they're going to leave the area. They're not generally available. You know, it puts a serious economic constraint on this industry. And I think we can see this in lots of different industries. And that's why Elizabeth said that those of us, you know, where our gardeners aren't coming, we're paying them anyway, because they're paycheck to paycheck, and they don't have the luxury to be able to live in this area without continuing to work. So that was a very serious concern that I felt was well expressed on the call. And George is putting all of that information together in a summary so that we can discuss it.
We added one more thing to the onion, which is obviously the people are worried about people on that site. So we are also adding that layer of the onion related to staff's protections, doing the inspections and so on and so forth on the site, what potential protocols can be put into play and agreed upon with the general contractors. So their responsibility on their site, even to the extent of if a inspector was on that site, shutting down that site for the duration of the inspection component and videotaping, photographing, creative ways to try to make sure that, you know, our staff stay safe as well.
Elizabeth, do you want to ask your question?
So my question had a little bit of what you were talking about also, but is there any way that the builders can, I know this sounds terrible, but screen or test workers before they enter the site? You know, like ask them, you know, have you been out of the country in the last 2 weeks? Have you, do you have a fever? Do you, you know, just general questions like that, not like really testing them for the virus, but general questions like that, and make sure you get their names and you know who is coming onto the site and the date and time, because in the event that one of these workers does come down with the virus, you're going to, you know, they're going to want to try to trace everyone that person has come into contact with.
Right. Yeah, that
was discussed as well. Yeah.
Yeah, that was discussed.
Was it?
Yeah, absolutely.
Well,
For exactly the reasons that you just mentioned. And I think that we also mentioned that this is kind of an evolving thing and it could change tomorrow, and that there is a huge responsibility on the contractor's part to reiterate, because who will be on a site today may not be on the site tomorrow. So they have some responsibility on their part to make the comments related, if you're sick, don't come to work, and so on and so forth, to make sure that all the people that are on that site know in advance of even coming to the site. But even that questionnaire and signing in and documenting the time was something that we had discussed.
Yeah, and
I have
it
to
puts a
tell you,
lot of
these workers,
responsibility. It
Go ahead.
a number of things that would put a significant amount of responsibility on project management to both monitor and record. And I felt like the members of the Builders Roundtable that are builders in the town that were there, they expressed that they had, I didn't hear real problems with any one of the suggestions. Now, we'll distill those down to specific guidelines, but I think the information that's valuable for the council is that it was a very cooperative meeting. People were really committed to both the goals that we've established and the reasons for which we closed construction, and finding a way to make it so that they could start to work again and adhere to the two guidelines that would not infringe on those goals that we were focused on.
Right. So my follow-up to that is, as well as everybody, that construction workers, they're pretty hardy type guys that work through pain and agony and injury, and they're pretty tough type guys. And so, to tell them to stay home if they're sick, they come to work anyway because they need the money.
I had a question and a couple of comments. My question first is, do we see a path where we could end up with a way, with guidelines or whatever, but there's some path that we think would mitigate the risk sufficient that we might be able to open, or things just, there's no way?
I think that there's two different issues. There's the issue of minimizing the likelihood of spreading the virus amongst people that don't know that they have it. And we have to be really thoughtful about what these guidelines are so that we minimize that. And I think we just have to see how things go in the next week or so to see whether we think that makes sense to open that up. Because obviously if you don't have people going together at construction, then you don't have the risk at all. And if you enable it, you want to minimize that risk as much as you possibly can. The other issue has to do with our staff. And we can't take the risk that our staff put themselves in a position where they're going to get sick, or else they're not available to do anything. And
Right.
I think George has been very focused on that, and that's got to be worked through, and we've got to see if staff thinks. But it may be that we allow some construction to go until it has to have an inspection, and then it shuts down. I think it's going to take some time to develop it. I don't know the answer to your question, Mike, but in my opinion, there could be a proposal that we could consider, and we could evaluate whether it makes sense or not.
Okay. And then I'm sorry, go ahead, Carrie.
I was just going to interject as well. I think that the public safety component, I mean, I'm going to say it, and there's not one person that's not trying to make sure that everything's safe. And it's not going to be treated in a mild manner if there is something that they're not following in the guidelines that we set up, and as a council, if we move forward, agreed, endorsed, right? They know that the ramification could be as quick as losing their business license to perform. And they're expressing that same type of language to the employees and the importance of the safety component, the cleanliness component. So, it's really a partnership together to come up with a reasonable roadmap, if it is, to come to the entire council to consider, subject to any modification, but, putting all the heads together to come up with some ground.
Okay, my comments first, a small one is, one thing we may want to consider is having whatever guidelines, if we end up with guidelines, signed not just by the general contractors, but also by the owners of the property, to give them an incentive to make sure it's complied with. And then my larger point is I very much support this effort and the way in which the subcommittee, I guess, Carrie and Rick, you're approaching it. It feels just right to me. I have one possible exception to that, which I worry a little bit about the timing, and I want to make sure that we're thoughtful, because the way this came up, it was, we had the meeting, was it today or yesterday, and it's going to get written down in notes, and we're going to discuss it next week. And I want to make sure that kind of timeline actually works. from what Rick said, it sounds like we want to wait a week anyway to see what happens, in which case that makes sense. But I'd hate to lose a week that we didn't need to lose due to process if we don't need to. That's my comment.
This is Mona. Good afternoon, Council. I want to speak specifically with respect to the Civic Center project and timing. I do want to point out that in addition to work being stopped for 30 days and having the potential consequence of the contractor terminating the contract altogether, even if we didn't stop the work for 30 days and it was some number less than that, 15 days, a week, 2 weeks, the cost associated with mobilizing and demobilizing based on the orders that we provide to them could result in the town incurring damages. And damages just essentially means that the mobilization costs and potentially losing their workforce and having to find others. It is possible, the way that this has been agendized, that the council comes up with preliminary direction for the manager to provide, at the very least, to the Civic Center project if it wishes, with a set of parameters, and then work with the roundtable to come up with more global requirements should the council determine that it wishes to allow other types of construction activities to occur. Part of the guidelines that could be included in there are that violation of the county's orders, including the town's directives, could be the subject of a misdemeanor. And that's not just for the owners of these construction projects, but the employees as well. So that might get their attention in ensuring that they're truly complying with social distancing, cleaning of hard surfaces every 2 hours, and so forth.
So Mona, why wouldn't a shutdown due to a pandemic not be a force majeure event?
Normally it would be. I can't explain why the contract that the town entered with SJ Amoroso was drafted the way that it was, but the language actually is construed for the benefit of SJ Amoroso and gives them the benefit of force majeure and not the town.
Force majeure is something that normally applies to both parties. It's not a single thing. I don't know. But, all right. Well, okay.
I don't disagree. It's worded in a way that I have, quite frankly, never seen, and it allows them to recover damages associated with any local orders, pandemics, court orders that prevent them from continuing with their construction activities.
Can we finish with the other property in construction and then separate out the town center? Because I think that's going to be
I think that's a good suggestion.
Good idea.
Let's finish with the general discussion of the subcommittee and the guidelines and any other issue related to construction in the town in general, and then let's turn to the town center.
Perfect.
George, is that a hand?
It was just a note, and Councilmember Widmer has noted it as well before. And you may have heard with other communities in the county that there's going to be an escalation. They're projecting an escalation in the infection rate. And as that occurs, other communities may be taking further action to restrict activity in their communities, which may include construction and residential construction. So if the week's wait will probably give us some feedback on how and or when that may occur in some of these other communities.
Yeah, I support that, although I want to make sure that we make an affirmative decision about that, and it's not just kind of presented like we'll talk about it next week. So I think the council should actually decide, do we want to wait a week? And it sounds like that's the right thing to do here.
Okay.
You know, just on my input, as far as the contractors component related to residential construction, I think that we're going to be able to come up with a reasonable guideline parameter, even after a further discussion with them next week, to give us a better outlook. And I think that they're prepared for this week being off. I mean, I guess we'd all love to have everybody back to work. But I think that the message from our side and their side is they're taking this seriously. And so to put a loosey-goosey one in play is not what anybody's looking for. So I think that this week is probably a week we can work together and literally be prepared to bring something to council maybe next week.
Well, in a week or two, I can tell you I've looked at all the data points and I've tried to, fit those to some curves. And, a projection that I've looked at says in the next week and a half to 2 weeks, we're going to have, and we don't know what the infection versus the testing is. Of course, I think most people haven't been tested, but just the infection confirmations is going to be over 2,000. And I think that the county is concerned. They, first off, they were concerned about the parks and the beaches being opened, and so they lobbied with the governor to fix that. And I think that there's also concern about the construction. And so I think some of this is going to come from above, not from below. And that's the indication I got from talking to some of the people at the county.
Well, I think it would be good to get the summary of the different points that came up at the meeting so we could begin to just refine those and share them and get down to something that will be be able to be presented to the council that's relatively close. And I do think that by next Wednesday, we're going to have a lot more information.
I agree.
Okay.
Okay, so let's move to the town center. And use Mona's statement as kind of the foundation for the discussion.
Can I lead with a few comments related to some comments that Amoreso made yesterday?
Yes, please. Why don't you summarize those?
So Amoreso, there were a lot of people from the Amoreso project because they are equally interested in moving forward safely. Commercial regulations, from my impression from their leadership, are far more, kind of ahead of where the residential construction is in that sense of making sites safe, the OSHA requirements, and they're really detailed about, social parameters, meaning keeping that 6-foot distance. But another emphasis on their part is that we are dealing with a 4-acre parcel. And so that is something that they're very much aware in educating their people, but people are going to be separated out quite a bit on a 4-acre parcel, depending about the number that we would allot. So that was something that they expressed yesterday, just to, start this off.
So Carrie, my understanding is they're putting up steel and the people are working closely to make sure the steel is aligned. They're not spending 6 feet apart when they were doing that. So I understand what you're saying and what they said to you, but I just don't believe that, given the phase that they're in, that people are working independently and could be 6 feet apart or more, especially where they are.
Well, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I can't say where they are going in the next coming weeks related to steel, but they still obviously, no pun intended, have to keep their safety in mind, meaning if it requires 2 people to be closer in proximity for the safety of both parties or all parties, that's going to be something that needs to, be considered, obviously. So, that was a discussion item. And, Bill, I agree with you in that sense. And I don't know if there's a mask or, glove requirements or something else that can come into play to assure some safety. I'm sure that most steel workers do wear gloves, but maybe there's a mask component or something like that. We did not have that level of discussion yesterday related to their site.
Yeah, wearing gloves. I've read some things about other communities about wearing gloves, and wearing the gloves that the construction workers cover aren't going to prevent the virus from spreading, because they're generally cloth type gloves, You have to wear the plastic gloves that make your hands sweat. And so I think part of it for me would be, where are you and what are you going to do? Okay. And maybe they say we're going to stop the steel and we're going to work on it. But even the rammed earth wall, people are working very, very closely with regards to that too. So based on where there have been from the times I've gone to the site most recently, I just don't see that there's some other things that they can be doing. And so unless, I think one of the things he should say what the guys should be doing, and maybe we can get Marty to confirm what those things are. I'm sure there are some things, but not a whole lot.
I will agree. I think that to get an idea of, especially during this next 2-week period of heightened risk, is there something that can be done in the next 2 weeks? We remind you, we didn't have this discussion, and really this is something that staff would have more of an idea than Rick and myself, frankly. But if there is something like that, it's definitely something to consider if we move forward with this.
Yeah, one thing that I think it's Jennifer Erskine, who is the person from the project that was on the call, that she said is that there definitely are situations where people have to work in closer proximity than 6 feet apart. They're handling heavy items where they have to be closer than that. And we just have to deal with that. And we didn't come up with guidelines. I would say in general, I'm very concerned about the language that's in the contract. And I guess I have a question for Mona, which is, what I understood from your email, Mona, was that if we have demobilized, so we may definitely incur some damages related to that demobilization, and we'll have to look at that. And if the termination of the work goes on for 30 days, then there's a clause in the contract that enables the contractor to possibly terminate the whole contract and claim damages if we were to put them back to work and they were able to remobilize in less than 30 days. I had understood from the email that that wouldn't be a problem, but it sounds like from your comments today, even that might be a problem, and I'd like to understand that better.
That's a good question. So the contract does contemplate termination if the project is halted for 30 days or more, or stopped. It is silent on what happens if the project is suspended. And my recommendation is that staff negotiate with Amoroso to discuss those now before they potentially become an issue. And then we can amend their contract or have a side agreement that addresses the limitations of those types of damages, or possibly even have them agree that they're not going to terminate the contract if there is a halt of 30 days or more.
One of the things I read in what you wrote, though, Mona, was that it wasn't just us halting the project for 30 days. There were other things associated with that were also in that paragraph, like material delivery. So the steel industry is shut down right now. So if they don't have their steel, they're not getting it. And there are other things that are industries that are shut down that may or may not be available. And so it's not just us shutting it down. From the wording that you sent us, it indicates it's a myriad of things that would prevent them from being able to perform their services, not just what we're doing.
That is correct. It's not just the town, it's any public authority having jurisdiction over the work. So that could mean the county, that could mean the state. Right now, we're not there. But it also, that language also says that they would be precluded from performing any of the work. So even if they don't have sufficient resources to do the steel work, but they are capable of doing other components related to the construction work, then that would not be deemed as an act on, they would have a more difficult time claiming damages under that scenario.
Well, I would recommend that you and George get on a call with them and hammer through what this means and what it doesn't mean, so we have a lot of clarity, because, you know, we're reading it one way and they may be reading it another way, and, you know, and who knows what the intent was, because we had an outside lawyer and we had Mr. Connors putting it together. So we need to also find out what the overall intent was and understand that as well. So, you know, my recommendation is we need more information before we can say, you know, we're up a creek without a paddle at this point in time, but sounds like we are.
Well, a couple of thoughts just based on that. It feels to me like if they can't perform, in effect, they would be in breach if we just lifted our end, and they shouldn't be benefiting from that if they wouldn't be able to accomplish the thing we signed them up to do because of not just government orders, but the fact that the economy is shut down.
Right.
The other point I'd make is we signed this agreement during a time of historic economic growth and demand for construction services in Silicon Valley, and those days are over. We are in a fundamentally different economic situation, and I think that they should recognize that just as business people and realize that they are not going to have a long stack of projects stacked up right now. I think the economy is, if this goes on much longer, the economy is going to hit a bit of, you know, a real wall that will affect their ability to get new contracts and new deals. And in fact, my guess is they'd be getting a windfall based on the agreement, the terms we, you know, agreed to, because now things are just going to be much, much, much cheaper than they were. So It seems to me there's commercial reasons for them to act reasonably. If they choose not to, it could hurt them. We actually might end up saving money if there's a problem here. I don't know.
Yeah, I will just one comment on lead time. I'm sure with this project, the materials ordered for this project were done months prior to this unfortunate coronavirus coming out. So, you know, if there was a new type order system and they were phasing it for something that they haven't developed months down the road, that'd be one thing. But if they're ready to do steel now, and, you know, we shut them off last week, they're still ready to do steel now. The worry is that somebody else wants to buy their steel. So that would be a concern.
Well, I think that there's a difference between them not being able to do the job because we have taken action to shut it down versus them not being able to do the job because of a supply or an employee problem, either of which could occur, right? I mean, they could have an employee problem because the virus gets a number of their employees and they just don't have the same workforce. But with the onus on us, it makes me very concerned. And I would like to, and I think this is a different issue than what we focused on at the subcommittee Builders Roundtable meeting, which was very principally focused on residential construction. Amoroso was there and they did make some comments, but I would like to authorize the staff to meet with them and talk through, and just like we are doing with the Builders Roundtable is developing some guidelines. I'd like to see us develop guidelines with Amoroso for what they need for them to be able to go back to work. Clearly, their work is included in emergency services. It's not, there's no order that would not include working on the town center as emergency services. We've just independently taken the action to shut that down because we felt like we didn't want to have our huge project going on when we were forcing private construction to be shut down. And I think this termination issue raises a completely different issue And I'd like to authorize the staff to meet with them and see if specific guidelines can be worked out with them that would make sense for them to go back to work.
I
So,
would,
Would the
can
library
I
be
make a
considered?
comment on what?
Yep, go ahead,
Go ahead.
Elizabeth.
Well, I just want to follow up on a comment from what you were just saying, because that is along my line of thinking, because things have changed with respect to why we shut it down, and the contract itself is such that it leaves us at risk by keeping it shut down. And it's not just an economic, I mean, it really is, it's the project. And if we can open it I think earlier than the April 7th, or at least at the latest at April 7th, even if the county keeps the shelter in place past that date, I would be in favor of doing that.
Somebody else was wanting to speak.
I just had a question. I'm sorry, Carrie, go ahead.
no, Mike, go.
Just had a question, which is the library considered an emergency service? Ricky said this would be emergency services clearly within the state or county. Would the library be part of that? That doesn't feel like an emergency to me.
Libraries are shut down.
I think it is.
It is the construction of any public works projects.
Well, but Rick's standard was emergency, I think. Are they different, or the?
They
No,
call
there's
them critical
two.
facilities,
Sorry.
not emergency facilities.
Essential services is the language.
Okay.
Yeah, but libraries are shut down by the county order. So you
So
can't.
Operations
there's a
of the
couple of
library.
different issues. There's a couple of different issues. Number one, there's operation versus construction. Operation was deemed of a library was deemed to not be an essential service, and that's why many libraries have been closed pursuant to local orders. However, the construction of the town's library is a public works project, and all public works projects, regardless of whether it is for infrastructure or other type of work, is permitted by the state order. The county's order, the county only allows residential, but by the state order.
Thank you. I just want to reiterate and come back to the mayor's comments. I think it would be, first of all, Amoroso was very good yesterday, and they're very interested in the same goal, and that's public safety and hopefully reopening their project. I think it would be very helpful to have staff get together with them and start that process yesterday to help us even make a decision on reopening this, just to implement some guidelines there as well. But I do also think that they would be open to that discussion. So I'm in favor of Rick's direction.
I think I would prefer to see staff focus on negotiating the contract, the terms, how the contract will be treated, because again, I think they have strong commercial reasons to not terminate, but to agree to a suspension without penalty or something like that. And I am concerned with the impression that we believe residential construction creates risks, including risks to the neighbors and others, such that it's not safe. We're not going to permit it. But for our project, either we don't care about those risks, or we've taken special steps to mitigate those risks, and therefore we want our project to proceed. But residents says you can't do that. I don't think that's an appropriate way to proceed. So I would prefer to see us first try to see if we get an agreement from Amoroso, not to sue us, to see if there's some room there, and B, to tie this to the residential stuff. I think if we end up with guidelines that are acceptable to prevent residential construction, then I think it makes perfect sense to have the civic center, the town center proceed, in a way that's consistent with that.
So I hear that, and that was really at the heart of why we decided to shut it down. We wanted to treat the two the same. There is a difference that I think is a material difference, and that is that if we agreed to allow construction to go back for residential pursuant to certain guidelines, it's very difficult to enforce that. Our police are not going to be going around enforcing it. It's going to be, the onus is going to be entirely on the project management to comply with those guidelines and to maintain the safety. And we're not going to have any real control over that. It's very different with the town center. We can control the situation at the town center. I mean, that is something we can manage. We've got staff on site at the town center. So I think in fact, there's a material difference in terms of that issue. I don't think there's a material difference in terms of the risk to the general public and the spread of the virus. I think that's the same issue. I just think that we can manage it at the town center. And I'll quit, but just one more short comment. I don't think that shutting down the residential construction really protects the local residents. I mean, it's designed to protect the larger public from the spread of the virus. The local residents who are close to construction, they only face a risk if they interact with the people. And that's why the guidelines would provide that that the people at the site don't eat from food trucks and they don't congregate in the right of way. But if residents have direct connection with the workers, then there's some risk. Or if they're touching things that the workers have touched, there's risk that the virus would spread. But in general, it's a very, very small risk that having construction means that local residents are going to get the virus.
This is Mona. I do want to make clear that I do not believe that we have any exposure to litigation based on the order that we take or don't take with respect to Amoroso. We have support for whatever decision we ultimately make. The question is simply whether there's going to be payment of damages if we prohibit them from constructing for 30 days or more.
Depends on how those are calculated, Mona. I would want to know more detail.
Well, I would say that, kind of the echoes comment of, there's kind of a two-facing to figure out where Amoroso is standing related to the contract is one phase, because either way, that'd be good to know. But, implementing whatever site restrictions or guidelines apply is kind of twofold. So, still consistent with, staff taking a big role in this, because this is our site.
Yeah, I got to say, I don't find that compelling. And for a couple of reasons. One is we started out saying that George has been very careful to protect our staff members to keep them from going to other sites. And again, we're saying, all right, it's okay on our own site. Marty, you can get sick, but we're not going to send somebody off to look at a project on Tuscaloosa or something. So yeah, I mean, I just would like to see us be consistent between the two if we can. And I think we can.
Rick?
Yeah, sorry. Go ahead, George.
One of the things that came up at the Builders Roundtable was a conversation not only around phases of construction, but also size of construction site and ways that the town could begin to resume construction in a phased manner so that you're only allowing projects of this size to continue first, and then you're slowly moving into your smaller, more compact sites later on in the COVID pandemic timeline. And so if you said, for example, project sites on 2 acres or more, or 3 acres or more could begin construction, but projects of a smaller size can't. And for some scientific reason, based on size of the project and number of workers and those sorts of things. Other things to think about.
Okay. Any other comments? Well, I'm not sure if we have agreed that staff should enter into a discussion with Amoroso. It seems like there's consensus that staff should talk to Amoroso about the contract. I don't think that the subcommittee has been focused, and it's not composed to be directly focused on this town center project. So if that discussion,
So can I?
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Well, about the discussion, go back to Amoroso and negotiate the contract. I think I'm not really clear, I guess, what Mike is asking us to do, renegotiate the contract such that they will not leave the project if they're shut down for more than 30 days, or renegotiate the price of the contract. I would hate to try to reopen the contract in this situation and, you know, renegotiate it. And I'm just not clear that, I guess the ultimate goal is we want some reassurance that they're not going to walk off the job because of this pandemic. And even if they can't get supplies, they're not going to walk off the job. We want that kind of reassurance. So maybe, Mike, you could explain what you would like to get out of going back and talking to them about the contract.
So
I see George raising his hand. George, you want to say something?
Yeah, before you jump in there, sorry. They sent us a letter. Amoroso sent us a letter. We're going to be reviewing, analyzing, and looking at that letter for a response, as well as a conversation around the legal issues associated with it. So that's something we're already going to be doing. I think the question for the council is, as we look at that and develop plans and scenarios for the residential construction to continue, we should also be looking for plans and strategies for the town center project to continue. I'll guarantee you, pursuant to the contract, we're going to be looking at some sort of delay, mobilization, demobilization, those sorts of costs. Those are going to be incumbent upon us to pay because they've incurred them. But I think we're already going to be looking at the contract and the legal issues associated with it because of the letter that they sent us.
Yep.
Okay, well, where I was coming from was I thought Mona was recommending that we provide some direction that specifically authorizes staff to enter into discussions with Amoroso about what guidelines would make sense for them to consider, you know, starting up the project again.
Yes.
Yes, and in addition to that, to start to negotiate what some of the ambiguity in the contract language with respect to force majeure or potential termination really mean as between the two parties, and be able to come to an agreement now before it actually would become an issue. And then certainly, if there is an agreement between staff and Amoroso, we would bring something back for the council's consideration.
Right. Yeah, I'd like to encourage that to happen so that we understand where they're at. I mean, if they want to go back to work tomorrow, and maybe that's what they said in the letter. I haven't seen the letter, but I'd like to understand that.
They would love to go back to work tomorrow. I think it's just a question around what guidelines we would like to impose.
Okay.
So I think I was the one who was probably sounded like the most, don't talk to Amoroso about guidelines. And I probably overstated that. It's not what I'm thinking. What I'm thinking is we should probably do that, but that we should not commit that we're going to agree to any of that. In my view, it really should be linked to whether we're going to permit residential construction. But if we do present, you know, if we do provide guidelines for both, the best thing to do is have them ready to go as quickly as possible so we can get in as quickly as possible.
But I would like to see staff and Mona get together with, you know, a phone call to Bill and talk to him about this clause and just see, was that even discussed at the time of finalizing the contract? And if so, what were the inferences What was the intent of the way it was? Because I think that that's key to some of the discussions we might end up having to have.
Yeah, I don't see it hurting talking to Bill, but I mean, I would agree with Mike in the same direction, maybe with that telephone call if he's not on a boat somewhere, having Mai Tais.
Yeah. And we did have an outside counsel work on it, so.
Yeah.
We are continuing to utilize the attorney that advised the council on the construction project. She has been apprised, and she will continue to help us with this.
Great.
Perfect.
Well, I think Mike's comments are fine. I think there's some urgency to get this moving so we can get to a point where we can, really talk to them about minimizing our costs in the remobilization and understand when that could happen and under what conditions.
Agreed.
Okay.
Okay. I think that's good direction on that one.
So what
And
we have to now recertify that we still agree that there's a state of emergency?
that's correct. And so that is just a motion by the council to certify the continuing emergency and ratification of rules and regulations enacted by the Director of Emergency Services.
I would like to make that motion.
Second.
Okay. All in favor? I think we'll do a roll call.
Aye for me. Widmer, aye.
We die.
Vice Mayor Lewis.
Anthony lost.
No, I'm here. You guys started, so I was just letting you continue.
All right, I'll go through the list here.
Okay, so Widmer's an aye, Weiss is an aye.
Well, I think you've got
Councilmember
3 ayes. I'm the 4th aye, and that leaves Elizabeth.
Aye.
Vice Mayor Lewis?
That was an aye. And then you have Councilmember Lewis, or Vice Mayor Lewis.
Okay. move on.
Hi there. I actually hung up on you by mistake because my phone went blank and I hit the wrong button. So sorry.
That's
Well,
my line.
So you're on,
Well, are
you're
you
on
a
the hook.
yes or a no?
I am a yes.
Motion passes 5-0.
Hold on, Elizabeth, do you know what we're talking about?
Am I a yes or a no?
Yeah, you were
What
yes.
am I yesing?
Still an emergency.
The research.
I think I'm in agreement with what Councilmember Lumpers is saying.
Okay, well, he voted for it, so we're going to take that as a yes.
Okay, I'm a yes.
Motion to adjourn.
Can I ask a quick question before we do that, which is simply, do we know, and are we going to know if any residents develop coronavirus?
We will know if that occurs. We'd get a notification. We just don't have all of the details. We won't be provided that.
And as of yet, we have not received any notification that any resident has coronavirus, correct?
That is correct.
Okay, well, that's good news.
That's good news.
Yep.
Second the motion to adjourn.
Okay,
I'll third it. I'll third it.
we are adjourned.
All right, thank you
Thank you,
guys.
guys.
See you later. Have a
Thank
good
you,
day.
George.
Bye,
Wait a
all.
minute, before we adjourn, can I just say one thing? I think George is doing an absolutely fantastic job of communicating, and you guys on the ground with the Builders Forum is really important. And I think we're leading by example in lots of ways. So thank you all.
Well, the daily COVID report is an important report.
Absolutely.
It's amazing. It's really, really great. Thank you.
Thank you.
It's a group
Bye.
effort. Thank you and good night.
Thank you.
All right,
Good
sure.
night.
Bye-bye.